Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and this was really one of the most rewarding stories I've worked on recently for a lot of reasons, both personal and because of the feedback I've gotten and we've gotten. I just want to correct, I'm a staff writer for the New York Times, so I was a freelancer for many, many years. But this was a subject that's near and dear to my heart because I kept encountering this in my own life. First, a cousin's wife who was diagnosed with very advanced stage colon cancer some years ago, even before she got to that magical age of 50 when you have a colonoscopy, and that was very tragic. Then I had a friend who reached the magic age of 50 and went in for her, like a good girl, for a colonoscopy, and she was diagnosed with stage 2. She's done extremely well. And then it happened again, and another young woman who was married to a former Newsday reporter also was diagnosed at a very late stage. So the only regret I have is I wish there were more GPs here today that hear this message and take it in and absorb it, and we just need to keep talking about it and writing about it. There are 2 parts to my presentation. And I just want anyone this is the science light part of this series. If you've had enough data and graphs for today, welcome, because I have none. And I really am speaking more. What I was asked to do is actually look at what people had written in comments to our stories, because we have this great interactive tool now where people can comment on our stories and find out what they were thinking. About what's causing this and what's driving this. And a lot of the comments were really about that. People were very concerned about what's in our environment, and what are we eating, and how are we eating it, and really whether it has implications beyond colon cancer. I want to introduce my panel. So after, there'll be two parts of this. First, I'll talk about what our commenters said. And we had a lot of comments on this story, almost 1,000, and it didn't even mention Donald Trump, and Stormy Daniels wasn't even, so that's a lot for a health story. But I do want to just first introduce my panel briefly. They'll be talking about their own experiences. Susan Thal is right in the middle. She lost a son to colon cancer in his 20s. Stacy Hurt at the my immediate, sorry. And you've already heard from her, she's a great speaker this morning. And Sarah Boyd, who I featured in a story about her own struggle with early onset cancer and the failure to get a diagnosis for a long time. This was the first story wrote after Rebecca Siegel's study came out and confirmed my suspicions that something was going on, and she really confirmed that something really is going on. So I'm not going to belabor this because this has been discussed. The usual suspects, age 50 and over, obviously that's not what's driving the young onset cancer, and lifestyle factors which have also been addressed, and especially diet, obesity, alcohol, and binge drinking, especially in young people, which we know is increasing a lot in women, and tobacco use. So the question is, what's new? What's affecting these people born since 1950? What's different? And really, what we're doing again, this is not scientific. I don't know if you know, Brian Larry always says this is a thoroughly unscientific, unofficial poll, and that's what this is. So a lot of the people who wrote in as commenters on our stories are not scientists. In fact, most of them are not scientists. And some of the things they said were totally wacky and totally off the wall. And you'll see I have one slide I call the kitchen sink because it's really just got everything in it. But we do want to look holistically to see what can be driving this, and maybe scientists can learn from this what they should be focusing on if they do case control studies, if they do observational studies, what questions they may be asking about diet, lifestyle, environmental exposures. Is it because we're all drinking out of plastic bottles these days, and so we're getting our water? Is it because we're all carrying cell phones attached to our hip? I mean, what's going on? This kind of, I have to say, the number one suspect in our readers' minds was food. And there were sort of 2 different aspects to this. There were dietary choices people are making, what they're eating, junk food, eating out a lot, not making homemade food. But there was also what's in our food in terms of impurities, contaminants, the way food is grown, pesticides, additives, things that we really don't even have much control over. And this was one of the comments I thought was kind of interesting. I recently taught, or you probably read it already, but I recently taught a friend of mine how to make pasta sauce from scratch. She'd never done so before. She's never met anyone who's done so before. Unfortunately, our eating culture has changed from home-cooked to Hot Pockets, fresh bread to Sara Lee, potatoes to potato skins with Velveeta. This reminds me of a story a friend of mine told when she had a little girl over to her house. She was watching her for a friend. She was doing a friend a favor, and the girl was about 8 or 10 years old, I guess, at the time. And the little girl told her, and she said, well, what do you like to eat? And the kid said, oh, I love chicken. So my friend said, oh, that's great. I happen to have a grilled chicken right here. And she brought out the grilled chicken, which was, a chicken, with a whole chicken. She broiled a chicken. And the kid said, that's not chicken. And she said, yeah, it's a chicken. What do you like? You want a poke? You want a breast? Do you like white meat? Do you like dark meat? And the girl just said, that's not chicken. This kid's whole experience and exposure to chicken was chicken McNuggets or chicken nuggets. She had never seen chicken in its whole form. So these are some of the comments we got. It's the food, This was, as I said, I didn't do an analysis and a structured analysis. I know the program promised that, but I did look at the comments very thoroughly, and many people were concerned about the Western diet. Meat, dairy, junk food, refined carbs, sugar. Now some of this we know some of these things are risk factors. Red meat, blackened food, charred meat does create some carcinogens in the process, and we know there's this association with red meat and high red meat diet. Not eating enough fruits and vegetables. We saw that this morning. It's very heavily associated with a reduced risk if you eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. Eating pizza every day, Lunchables. The whole issue of breastfeeding versus formula. High protein diets. This is really a pretty strong trend among young people, interestingly, especially athletes who are consuming these high protein shakes that are made of powders that are very, very processed. This is my kitchen sink slide. What's in our food? And again, I just want to emphasize, I'm not saying there's scientific evidence behind any of these. We actually just ran a story in the New York Times saying GMOs are safe, but people are very concerned about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And glyphosate is often seen as a villain. It is a weed killer that's heavily used all around the world. I think it may be the #1 weed killer. And it's particularly used heavily on genetically modified plants because they've been modified to withstand being literally deluged with this stuff. So what that means is they can be sprayed and they can still produce fruit or vegetables, and yet those are going to have higher amounts than what we typically might see. People are concerned about the drinking water. People are concerned about bottled water. And we know now there are bottles that don't have BPA in them, but they have other chemicals in them, the plastic bottles. High fructose corn syrup, which is used in a lot of foods. And you can see a lot of things. Some things jumped out at me, surprisingly, titanium dioxide. Apparently this is a whitener that's used in a lot of additives or medications and some foods. And of course everything's wrapped in plastic. The microbiome has been mentioned, and we know there's a lot of research that needs to be done on that, and a lot of concern about changes in the microbiome because of what we're eating and what we're exposed to, and of course the antibiotic use. Cell phones. We now know there's been a lot of back and forth about cell phones. There's no study tying cell phones to colorectal cancers, but are some studies now that the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences has determined that there is a correlation between cell phones and radio frequency radiation and certain heart tumors in rats, in male rats in particular. So this radiation, which we think of as being fairly benign, does seem to be having some effects. And obviously that's another thing that's been a huge change in recent years, and we're sort of bathed in it. Pollution, obviously air pollution and water pollution. Rising toilet heights, this is kind of an interesting one. But it's not entirely, it's funny, but there's something to it. There's something about a higher toilet that makes it harder to evacuate fully, apparently. And so that's something to think about. And these are just kind of oddities people throwing. Chemicals in diapers, tampons, sanitary wipes. We're using a lot more disposable products. One person wrote, I recall my mother using a warm, wet cotton towel washcloth on my baby brother. And there was a whole trend recently of moms going back to using cloth diapers, which of course is a demanding thing to do. Reduction in aspirin use, this came up before, and we know aspirin does have a protective role in some cancers, and particularly in colon cancer. People are told now, people over 50 are told to take baby aspirin, not just to reduce cardiovascular disease, but also as preventive against colon cancer. And we don't give our kids aspirin anymore because of the risk of a rare, I believe it was a rare but very serious complication. It was mentioned earlier as well. A lot of people mentioned prescription drugs. I'm talking about prescription drugs that people are taking kind of for the rest of their life. Not necessarily Accutane, but whether it's ADHD or antidepressants or statins. I mean, we're on a lot of drugs that we don't just take for a course till we're better, but we take continually. And alcohol. And we know, I think several of the speakers mentioned, alcohol is a carcinogen. Young people drink a lot of alcohol. They go through periods often when they're really drinking very, very, very heavy amounts of alcohol. And our all favorite stress, which is kind of everybody's favorite villain and culprit. And I do think that we are seeing in young kids, we know young teenagers and young adults are having epidemic rates of anxiety and depression, and does this cause inflammation? Does this cause changes? We don't really know, but our readers thought it was a concern. So I'm going to now turn over to our panel. So I wanted each person to just briefly, if you could, tell us, start with just introducing yourself and saying how you encountered colon cancer. We have 2 survivors, and we also have a parent. And so they'll just briefly give you an idea of what their experience was and also why it came as a surprise to them.
Okay.
Stacy, we'll start.
Okay. I'm Stacy Hurt. When I was diagnosed on my 44th birthday, September 17th, 2014. I was diagnosed via colonoscopy. My symptoms were rectal bleeding, abdominal pain, fatigue. I was very fortunate. My PCP sent me for a scope, which revealed immediately an 11-centimeter tumor in my rectum, and a subsequent PET scan revealed I had cancer in 27 places in my body. The oncologists didn't hold out much hope for me. I had an unprecedented response to Folfox, shrunk everything, made me a surgical candidate in April of 2015, resected the rectum, the liver. We did CyberKnife on the lungs, and I have been NED for 2 years. So hopefully you can tell I'm a career athlete. I don't, but no, I played basketball and volleyball throughout high school and college. I ran, I was a runner, I was a rule follower, so it was completely unexpected. the thing, I guess, that's unique about me is that both of my parents have autoimmune disorders. Oh yeah, sure. I'm sorry. Next.
To mention that everyone on this panel has a running connection and runs marathons, or did, and Susan's son ran, and Susan, yourself, you also run marathons. So it's kind of also an interesting counterintuitive finding here.
All right, I'm Susan Thal, and my son Chase Johnson, in the summer of 2011, he was training for Twin Cities Marathon. As I said last night, he went to the emergency room for bleeding in June, sent away, must be internal hemorrhoids in October, the night before he was running the marathon, over at my house for the big spaghetti dinner, and said, I can't eat because every time I eat, I have pain. And ran the marathon, decent time. A week later, he's having surgery for stage 4 colon cancer. Total shock to us. Thought it was myself, maybe stress or something. He was 24 years old, 2 weeks before his 25th birthday. No cancer in our family, so it wasn't on our radar at all. And, we just had none of the signs at all with that. And he went through the typical chemo treatments that you do, and after a year they weren't working, and he had HIPAC surgery on his anniversary date up in Pittsburgh, and then 6 months later, after that, it's back bad, and he had surgery to remove some more colon and had short bowel syndrome, and then his last year he was on TPM and eventually had the G-tube and tumors cut off his food his last 4 months. So he passed away in January of 2015, age 28.
I'm Sarah DeBoard. I fortunately work for the Colon Cancer Coalition and get to live and breathe my passion, not only my personal life, but my work life. I was diagnosed when I was 34 after the birth of my second son, but I had had symptoms for 10 years prior. At age 24, I finally went into a gastroenterologist at the urging of one of my dearest friends, who's a PA, after asking her about blood in my stool. So I had had blood in my stool since my early 20s. It was very noticeable and unavoidable by 24, and that gastro performed a flex sig on me, said, I don't see anything, but it's probably just hemorrhoids. You don't have any, but it's probably just hemorrhoids. So for the next 10 years, as I continually saw blood in my stool, I wrote it off and said, must be those hemorrhoids I don't have. It wasn't until my second son was born, I started training for a half marathon, and my symptoms got unavoidable. They were impacting my life and my lifestyle, especially training. And I blamed everything on having just had a baby, because all too often the symptoms are masked as postpartum symptoms. I hear that from a lot of moms I know that were diagnosed, and also training for marathons. So I excused the weight loss on just having a baby and running and nursing. Of course, you're going to lose weight. The fatigue on getting up 5 times a night to nurse a baby, and then cross-training 3 days a week, and going on long runs, and all the physical activity I was doing. And obviously the blood in my stool, well, I actually had a baby, so I probably did have hemorrhoids now. And the fatigue, I mean, I was at the point where I couldn't stand up. I had the weight loss, I had the blood in my stool, and finally what got me to the doctor was my change in bowel habits. I was no longer able to get up and go out for that 6:30 a.m. run in the middle of July on a hot summer day. I had to wait until I felt evacuated enough. I mean, it was taking me all morning to empty my bowels, which really cramped my running style. And that's when I finally realized something definitely isn't right, and went to the doctor and was diagnosed at 34.
So we definitely have some challenges, particularly with diagnosing this in young women, because anemia is often blamed on menstruation and hemorrhoids, especially after you've had children. You're just assumed to have hemorrhoids, so that's a special challenge. You've each thought a little bit about, I don't think any of you are why me kind of people, but you've each thought, what could it have been? Are there any factors in my past, in my lifetime, my family history, that may have triggered or been the genesis for this? So I wanted each of you to just briefly tell us about those things.
Both of my parents had polyps, but they had them after 50, and they just downplayed them. I came to find out after. We had a couple polyps, they were removed. So I don't think that was really the tie. What's unique? Oh, yeah, yeah. I had no idea until after I was diagnosed. So that's important family history. Very, yeah. Both of my parents have autoimmune disorders. My dad has psoriatic arthritis, and my mother has polycythemia. I myself have a disabled son. He doesn't walk, talk, or do anything for himself, and he has a rare chromosome disorder that's one of 3 in the world. It's a 1q duplication. The syndrome is so rare, it doesn't even have a name. So I'd just like to offer to our researchers in the room, if you could please take a look at these links between mutant DNA, why this happens with genetics, the link to autoimmune disorders, I would be grateful because, as I said in my intro, I was one of these 10% what they call exceptional responders. So we don't know why it happened, and the fact that I had this mutant DNA, that it got invaded and it happened, but then its ability to repair itself has been remarkable. So I would just like to offer that as something that's unique about me that hopefully we can look at going forward.
My story is a little different. As I said, there were no signs in our family history. I'm 60 years old. Ooh, had my birthday last month. And I've done my colonoscopies, and nothing's shown up on them. Chase's dad, same thing. Nothing's shown up on them at all, or in our family history. So to me, my layman has always been there's something with our environment, and what's different about Chase from my other 3 kids. He's my middle one. Some of the things I've thought of is that he had a lot of ear infections growing up. He was on amoxicillin a lot, and eventually had his tonsils out when I think he was age 7. And then he played sports through high school. So he took a lot of ibuprofen when he'd have sports injuries on empty stomachs, which I know you're not supposed to. And so that's the things that I think about. He also is a very healthy eater. So he ate a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables. So I think what chemicals are in our fruits and vegetables? How did that affect him and affect his body? So, mine is just environmental, really.
I fall into the family history category. I have no genetic mutations, but I do have an aunt that was diagnosed at 51 with stage 4. I was age 30 at the time. When I was doing my initial GI intake, I asked my mother about her history, and she said she had polyps removed beginning at age 40. At the time, I didn't know family history played a huge role. Now, in retrospect, I'm shocked that her own gastroenterologist never said to her, your children are at risk, my cousins, her family, everybody in our family needed to be screened. So if he's ever on an elevator alone with me, better watch out. When I look at my own life and my own lifestyle, Stacy mentioned the autoimmune diseases. My mother, the very one with polyps, has 14 autoimmune diseases, celiac disease being one of them. They believe my grandmother also had celiac. I don't, thank goodness. But I was born very lactose intolerant, very lactose intolerant. So it seems to be in my family there are a lot of GI issues on top of the polyps and the family history. So I always kind of link back to, is there something genetic in my family, even though I don't have mutations, something that hasn't been discovered that ultimately puts my family at greater risk.
And I'd love to hear from scientists maybe afterwards about whether you're picking up on anything that we know from the literature or really should be further explored. When you look at some of the other things that were raised in my little slideshow and the readers' comments and some of this the general kind of zeitgeist about what people are thinking, what people are worried about, is there anything that rings true to you or that you think should be particularly explored in future research?
I mean, I'll get on my little soapbox and say that I don't think that this is any coincidence that you're seeing this rise in younger people with the link to processed foods, known carcinogens in foods, environmental factors, rising obesity rates. I'm not saying that's everybody, but I think that we could definitely make a huge dent if we looked, a little closer at those things and took more action preventatively to that end. Roni eloquently talked about it, and we've talked about it, but you know, I'm sticking with that. I mean, we're seeing a now society. We're seeing a convenience society for these prepared foods, for now, for this, for that, and a step away from the home cooking. So I don't think there's any coincidences in life. I think there's definitely a link there.
I also think that strong enough food, as I was listening to the slide she was talking about, something that triggered in my mind was, because Chase was into sports, he did do those protein powders through high school, and in college he was a hockey player and a soccer player. And so, and they did do that and the lifting weights with his friends. Now he's the only one that's come up with colon cancer in his group. But as I run into more young people in my community that have gotten colon cancer, there's a lot of them that it's not in their family history. So I just question really what we eat and what's involved in the food that we eat with the chemicals versus I'm 60 years old, and that was just something that, as you could see from the slides, you know, and now it's on the rise. And then when I was in my 20s, it was not. So what's changed in our environment, what's changed in our food in these last 20, 30 years?
And I'm going to piggyback on what Stacy and Susan said. I would definitely say diet. As a child of the 70s and 80s, I mean, going out for fast food was kind of a treat. You know, when my dad and I might go get Frosties on Sunday night. But now with our instant gratification society, you know, the internet, everything right here, right now, I think fast food has become a way of life. Just with the slides that Dr. Weber put up, I mean, we see this trend of rising young adult rates in countries in Europe, in India, in China, places that didn't have a Western diet. But if you go there now, what do you see? You see Chick-fil-A's, you see KFC's and McDonald's. And so the Western diet is being introduced into countries that never ate it before. And I personally think there's a definite connection between the introduction of Western diet and fast food into other countries and their rise in young onset rates. So I'm going to vote for food, GMOs, processed food as well.
Yeah, I think one of the speakers noted, and when I was doing some research for this, that there's an increase in young, early onset colorectal cancer in Pakistan, which seems to be correlated to developing, to, you know, it becoming a more developed a country. One thing that came up in the slides that I deliberately omitted because of conversations I had with Rebecca Siegel about this when it came up, which was a lot of people seem to think that HPV virus is playing a role in this, and I think they're mixing up anal cancer and rectal cancer. Can you address that? Is that?
So it's a great thought because there is an increase now in HPV-associated oral cancers, and it is associated with about 90% of anal cancer. But as far as we know, HPV is only associated with squamous cell carcinoma, and a very small percentage of rectal cancers and colon cancers are squamous cell. And so HPV does not appear to be something that we should be focusing on. But again, you know, all of the research is done in older patients, so it could be different in young patients.
I think we have a few minutes left because I'm a journalist, I'm good with deadlines. So do people have some questions for the panel that they'd like to throw out here?
So Rick Wychik from the NIH. So I'm struck by the comments about how the individuals suffering from this disease, early stage onset colorectal cancer, were intense athletes. So actually athletics, and actually I exercise a lot, I'm a big proponent of it, but it is very pro-inflammatory. And so what's the work out there? Is moderate exercise actually associated with beneficial effects, whereas intense marathon running, where you're doing it every day and really pounding your body, is that deleterious?
I was not a marathon runner. At basketball drills, I was the last one to finish. So
I was the obsessive workout girl. I'm from LA. I counted every calorie. I worked out obsessively 6 days a week. So I would say I'm not an athlete, and I'm by no means, one of those amazing physical specimens, but I definitely worked out obsessively. So, I mean, definite possibility.
Yeah, and to that point though, I went from sport to sport to sport to sport, so I was always doing some sort of physical exertion on my body. But I think my biggest thing, I think we talked about lack of sleep and stress. My disabled son has been up every single night for 12 years. So I suffer with intense sleep deprivation. Do I think that that's stressed again? So I maybe had this mutant DNA from some sort of genetic, weirdness, and this stress on my cells made them go awry. And to your point, I think that's definitely a solid theory, for sure.
I just wanted to underline Dr. Rosick's point. One of the patients that we've been trying to help, a gentleman named Tate in California, he is a extreme sports photographer. So, he's in at least as good shape as these people trying to run up mountains and all these other incredible, crazy things. And he's not doing very well, but we write back and forth to each other. And he wrote to me recently and he said, one thing I'm really interested in are these anaerobic states, prolonged anaerobic states that we put ourselves into, and whether that might somehow contribute. So it's obviously anecdotal, but it resonates with your point, Rick. Resonates with your point. And since I have the microphone, I just want to underscore, you were 44 years old. You had a family history of polyps. This goes back to Christine's point made last night and again today. If we applied ourselves to following our own evidence-based guidelines with determination, we might have some different outcomes. So, I'm sorry that you weren't screened at 44, but it's really important for us to all acknowledge that that was probably a major missed opportunity.
Anyone else have any questions? Yes?
Actually, just a comment to follow up on Dr. Rucker's point. One of the things which is, and I know how geneticists do, one of the issues is the vast majority of individuals do not know if their family, if their first degree relatives have actually had a adenomatous polyp. And so one of the things which I think we have to do as, especially in gastroenterology, actually, is incumbent upon when the actual colonoscopy is done, which shows the advanced adenoma, that we have to be discussing not only the implications for the patient in front of us, but their relatives. And that's actually where I think we are actually dropping the ball. It wasn't that people didn't talk to them, tell their doctors they had a parent with an adenoma. They actually didn't know. And in fact, it has been, the entire specialty has been, well, we got it out, it's benign, because it's not a cancer. But instead, we probably should be including in the pathology reports, this is an advanced adenoma. It has implications for follow-up for the patient as well as their family members. Because until we do that, we're going to have these stories continually of patients not knowing about the polyps until after.
Well, I just wanted to comment one thing on this. I have 2 other children. I have a daughter that's 25 and a son that's 34, and they immediately went in for colonoscopies, and that's exactly what I was told. And now, just from what I've heard from this, I'm going back and we're going to find out what those are, because they did not tell us that at all. And they knew Chase's story, and they said, oh, we got it all, we're okay.
I think that's a really, really good point for physicians and patients and consumers to know. And for parents and families, again, we talk about this all the time, but sharing your family, sharing your medical history, even things that aren't unpleasant or seem like they're just blips because they may have a different implication for the next generation. So I think we're good and finished on time. So
I was going to, just because I have all of you, if I could just thank you from the bottom of our hearts, speaking for the survivors. As clinicians, as researchers, we cannot thank you enough for your attention to this important issue. Young people are suffering, young people are dying. We don't know why. It's on the rise. It also has a stigma. Nobody wants to talk about poop, let's face facts, or rectal bleeding or any of that. And so we just really appreciate your commitment to this cause and encouraging the dialogue. So thank you so much for being here, seriously.
thank you.